Good morning once again, church. God bless you for studying again today with me. Here we are beginning the Gospel of Mark. We finished Revelation yesterday. It's a beautiful gospel that we're about to explore. The Gospel of Mark is unique, very unique. And today we're just going to have an introduction because when you think about Mark, yes, of course, most of scholarship, if not the majority of scholarship, understands that this book called the Gospel of Mark is attributed to the author Mark. But who is Mark? What does he do? We don't really see him as a leader in the early church. In the book of Acts, we don't really see him as an apostle. He wasn't one of the 12 that walked with Jesus. We don't hear much at all about him in the New Testament. But there are clues to help us understand who this person is and where they got their information about Jesus to write this gospel. Scholarship thinks this gospel was written probably in about 70 AD, which is, how do we know? We weren't there. But nonetheless, based on the history that they've discovered, that's the point of a date for this gospel. But let's back up a minute this morning and look at this gospel from a different angle. When you look at the first verse of the Gospel of Mark, it starts very simply. Mark just says, look, in the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, and he gives Jesus really two titles. He's the Christ, and here he's called the Son of God. What we're going to find as we go through Mark is that Mark is very condensed. He omits many of the large discourses where Jesus gives long sermons. In the Gospel of Mark, that's hardly ever found, only a couple of times. Okay, and so we might call the Gospel of Mark almost like the Reader's Digest version or the Cliff Notes of the life of Jesus. He has condensed his gospel, and he's rapid fire as he describes the events of Jesus' life. But I want you to see something as we begin this morning. You've been to games maybe where you've entered a stadium. Okay, so you look at the game from whatever perspective you are sitting in the stadium. I just wanted to relate this to the gospel writers. Say Matthew's on this side of the stadium and he's looking at the life of Jesus. Well, he's going to see it from a different perspective. He's going to record some things that are unique to him, but the life of Jesus is the life of Jesus, and it's the same event after event, so he's going to have things in common. If you expand this idea, maybe you would look at Luke as on the other side of the stadium. He's going to see the same life of Jesus, like the participant in the stadium would see the same game, right? He would record the same game, but he would see it from a different angle, a different viewpoint, adding some things, not including other things. Well, Mark is sort of I guess we'll put him down here on the end zone. He's the guy that he sees the game. It's the same game. He sees the life of Jesus, but his version is a little bit different than the others. His isn't the same. And just to round out the whole thing, well, before we do that, let's look at these three Gospels, because the scholarship says that these three Gospels are basically very, very similar. They include much of the same history of Jesus' life. In fact, they've even given them a name. They're called the Synoptic Gospels, meaning that they're all almost synchronized. They're together in so many ways. All right, we'll see that as we look at Mark's gospel. But we also want to think about John before we leave. John's gospel is sort of like the blimp that's flying over the top of the stadium. John is probably the greatest Christological testimony to who Jesus is and the deity of Jesus and the majesty of Jesus. John will focus on the theology of what's happening from up above, the big picture view. where the synoptic gospels largely just tell the story, although there's certainly a ton of Christology in all of them as well. All right, so that's what we're looking at. So how do we figure out who this man named Mark is? Well, the best way to do it is to go through the New Testament and see if we can find him. So let's do that. I'm going to take you to Acts chapter 12. If you remember, in Acts chapter 12, King Herod has killed James, one of the main apostles in Jesus' ministry. He just slew him with a sword, and he saw that that was so popular among the people that he arrested Peter as well, and he was planning on killing Peter as well to gain even more popularity with the Jews. Well, what happens? God gives Peter a heavenly jailbreak, and Peter's walking down the street after the angel says, "Go ahead, get out of here. I've got you all the way out to the street. Take off." Well, in verse 11, we read this: when Peter came to himself, because I think he thought he was dreaming, he said, "Now I am sure that the Lord has sent his angel and rescued me from the hand of Herod and from all that the Jewish people were expecting." In other words, they wanted him dead. But in the next verse, we watch this. It says, when he realized this, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John. So here we see there's a mom named Mary and there's a son named John. But now we're told whose other name was Mark. Okay. So now we have two names for this man, John and Mark. Where many were gathered together and were praying. If you remember that story, Peter keeps knocking on the door, and even when the young lady comes to open the door, she's so excited that it's Peter, she doesn't open the door. Peter's standing outside knocking on the door. But this would tell us that Mark has had contact with Peter. All right. We also know that he has two names, John Mark. We also know that his mother's name is Mary. Okay, so there are some clues. We know Mark is somehow connected to Peter. Mark was there in this event to understand the story that Peter gives about the miracle, the fact that God's power has released Peter from the clutches of Herod. Okay, well, that's one place to go in this. If you look a little further in chapter 12, when Paul and Barnabas come back from Jerusalem, they bring somebody with them. Watch this. Paul and Barnabas, or Saul as Paul's name was at that point, they returned from Jerusalem. When they had completed their service, they were delivering an offering to the people of Jerusalem, bringing with them John, whose other name was Mark. Okay, so now we know, again, two names, but now we know that Mark has contact with Paul as well as Peter, and Barnabas as well. In fact, we'll learn more about that relationship in a minute, but there's a problem. There's a problem. You know, this church in Antioch sends Paul and Barnabas on the first missionary trip. And here's the account in chapter 13. While they were worshiping the Lord and fasting, the Holy Spirit said, "Set apart for me Barnabas and Saul for the work to which I have called them." They're about to leave on the first missionary journey. Now, Paul and his companions set sail from Paphos and came to Perga in Pamphylia, and John left them and returned to Jerusalem. Do you see this? John Mark, and we'll make sure it was John Mark here in a second, but John Mark apparently accompanied Paul and Barnabas on this first missionary journey, but he got halfway through it and he left. He returned to Jerusalem. He said, in essence, "Guys, I've had enough of this missionary life. I'm not going to do this anymore. I got to go." We don't know exactly why he had to go. Was somebody in his family sick? Did he have a medical emergency himself? Was he just homesick? Was he not into traveling? Well, we're not sure. But what we're told is that he left. All right, he left. Okay, well, later on in the second missionary journey, when you get to Acts chapter 15, Barnabas wanted to take with them John called Mark. Paul wants to go back through the cities that he visited on the first journey He's going to take Barnabas with him. That's the plan on the second trip. And Barnabas says, well, we took John Mark before. Let's take him again. Well, Paul doesn't like that idea. Why? Well, let's just watch. But Paul thought best not to take with them one who had withdrawn from them in Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work. In other words, Paul is stuck on the fact that Mark left last time they went on a journey, and Paul's upset about it. He doesn't want to take him again. Why should we take a deserter with us? Let's just go and do the work. Well, this ends sort of badly, doesn't it? In verse 39 we read, and there arose a sharp disagreement, so that they separated from each other. Paul and Barnabas split. They go separate ways. Why? What's the manner of contention? Mark is a deserter in Paul's mind. Mark is not going to accompany them on the second journey. And Barnabas is so upset about that he says, well, okay, if you don't want Mark, I'm not going either. Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed away to Cyprus. So now Paul's going without Barnabas and without Mark because Mark abandoned them in the first missionary journey. So we understand now that there is some trouble, some discord between Paul and Mark, right? Barnabas has tried to reunite them, but he was unsuccessful. All right, so we get that far. That's a little more about Mark, but again, when you search the New Testament, you'll find something else. And that is that this disagreement, discord that Paul had towards Mark went away. It was forgiven. They were restored. How do I know? Well, when you get to the end of the book of Colossians, many times at the end of these books, the Apostle Paul or whoever's writing the book, the Apostle Peter, they'll list people that they want you to greet. They might mention the plans of where they're going. They might mention personal things about what they're going through at the present time. Well, here at the end of the book of Colossians, we read that Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you. We know then what? That Paul's in prison. We know Paul wrote the book to the church at Colossae, so we know this is Paul speaking. Okay? Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you, and Mark, the cousin of Barnabas. So now we find out something else about Mark. Well, a couple things. One is Mark is now with Paul, right? Mark is with him. There must have been some kind of resolution to their conflict, and now we see that Mark is also the cousin related to Barnabas, right? So, and Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, concerning whom you have received instructions, if he comes to you, welcome him. Okay, so Mark is sending greetings to the church at Colossae while Paul is in prison, and Mark is obviously with Paul again to do that, to get that accomplished. Well, you read again about Mark in one of the letters Paul wrote, 2 Timothy 4. Luke alone was with me, but look at this. Get Mark and bring him with you, for he is very useful to me for ministry. So now Paul's not only in the presence of Mark, having reconciled with him, but now Paul is understanding the value of Mark in terms of his ability to follow Jesus as a minister and keep things moving forward, right? So there's been reconciliation, but when we look at two guys, let me just say it this way. If you look at the book of Acts, you'll see that the first half of the book of Acts basically is about Peter and the founding of the church. As Jesus says, you're going to witness to me in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the outermost part of the world. Well, when we look at the first half of the book of Acts, we see that Peter takes care of Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria. And the second half of the book of Acts is largely about Paul, okay, who takes it to the uttermost parts of the world. All right, what we're going to find, though, as we study, is that Peter has the greater influence on Mark. When we get to the end of Peter's first letter, we read, she who is at Babylon, that's Rome, who is likewise chosen, sends you greetings, and so does Mark my son. Now we find Mark in Rome with Peter. What does that tell us? Well, here's how scholarship has interpreted these things. Scholarship has basically said that Mark writes his gospel through the eyes of Peter. That this time that Mark spends with Peter is the time where he hears the first-hand accounts of Jesus' life, and he writes as Peter helps him understand the things that Jesus does in the ministry of Jesus. Okay, so we know what? Mark was around in the early church. He really didn't have any big position that we know of. He wasn't a preacher that we know of. He wasn't a teacher. Well, maybe he was. There's a hint of that in one of the verses we saw today. Was he an apostle? No, but God decided to use him to write this concise, to-the-point gospel. It's amazing. God will use anybody God wants to use, right? That's how God works. So we're going to go back to the beginning, Mark 1:1. In the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Again, this is where Mark begins. This is where we're going to start in our next study to try to unpack the basic points that Mark makes about the life of Jesus Christ. Buckle up. This is going to be a great study for us. I think we will see Jesus from a whole new light as we watch Mark describe him to us. I look forward to it. I hope you join me again for the next study, and I'll see you then. God bless you. Serve him well today.